You know, if I was an identical twin, I bet my identical twin would eat me because I'd be the weaker twin. That being said, we're on day 4 of November. This is the day of grain, I believe. Let's load up that November prompt. We're gonna be making grain, and I saw that everybody's making coffee beans. They're making corn, and that's cute. You know, you could show that to your parents and be like, oh, you know, this is my first little attempt. Fuck that. We're gonna go all the way out. We're gonna be making a field of wheat or dog hair or whatever this is, not using fur. I know it looks like fur, but actually this is only a single cube with vector displacement. How is that possible, you're saying? Chill. Let me show you how to do it. Okay, so here's the blend file as always. This is the completed version. I'm gonna show you how to get most of the way there. But just like, you know, most karate masters, I can only show you the door. I'm not gonna be fucking opening it for you, okay? You gotta put in a tiny bit of effort. Open the door yourself. I'll show you the map. I'll like navigate the train system for you. Point is, this is the same project. You're saying, wow, why is it looking like garbage in the blend file? And it's because this one requires more subdivisions than some of the other projects. So if we bring this down, Blender's gonna like choke and chug, and now you're seeing that it's starting to converge a bit. Because of some technical reasons that we are gonna go over, this is gonna require quite a few divisions, more so than the last projects. But before we get into that, what are the sliders? As always, we made a node for this. Well, we have the transform slider. This is the one that gives us either a cube once it loads or a field of whatever. We have the grain height. This is just going to be how tall this wheat is. Wow, that's some very tall wheat. What a harvest. Interstellar would have wanted that. We have grain variation. This is just going to be not just the height, but how varied the wheat is, which I'm told from my farmer friend. That's right, I consulted a farmer friend. Variation should actually be set to 0 because nowadays they're cutting it perfectly, but whatever. Forget about that. We have the grain amount, the number of rows. This is a cool slider. This is, you know, how many rows the thing has been pulled into, and then we have puddles and stuff like that. We don't need to go over the whole thing. Point is, when we open up the node network, you see that I've actually started organizing it. That's right. I've looked at some of the previous tutorials, and it's not that I'm ashamed. It's just that I can do better. So this time, since we are doing a lot of steps with vector displacement, let's try to change it up. Let's try to keep it clean. Okay, new blend project. We're starting. Again, if you want the original blend file, again, we're not going to be taking it all the way to completion. I'm a broken record shattered to pieces. If you want the original blend file, that's on Patreon. It exists. Moving on. Again, we're not going to be doing the setup file because you guys don't need to be hand-holding, holding of hands, sweating on hands. No. What we're going to do is just set it up the same way as we always do. So we want to set up a HDRI system, so I'm going to be using cycles with the GPU this time, by the way. Eventually, we're going to switch to experimental feature set, which is something we haven't talked about. So just keep your ball sack on the prize here, okay? That's going to come in our future. Also, some things to consider: film transparent so that we don't see the HDRI, and for the material that I guess already exists for our cube, just make sure that the settings have displacement. Settings have displacement set to displacement only. Again, the reason we do this is because the displacement and bump create some lighting artifacts. Finally, we need to set up our HDRI, so go to the World tab, go over here, ba-boom, ba-boom. You've seen me do this 1,000 times. You know this like you know the back of the back of something. I don't know what. Boom, HDRI. I think we are now set up, okay? So now the name of the game really is just doing a bunch, like usual, but more so than usual. The name of the game is doing a bunch of vector displacement transformations, one after another in the exact correct sequence. Now, you might be wondering, how do we get a field of wheat out of a cube? And that's where the idea kind of gets confusing. So first of all, what we want to do is take our cube and flatten it out so it's not like this kind of three-dimensional putty thing, but it can all be flattened out on the floor. We're then going to turn it into a circle, so like a circular base on the floor, add a couple mountains or a bit of displacement for the kind of terrain, and then we are going to grow our fur. Now, probably the most confusing part of this, I'm not going to lie, is doing that flattening out and turning it into a circle, so let's talk about that extensively. So, first thing we're going to do, actually we don't even need to add a vector displacement node in, by the way. You could just apparently hook it up right into the displacement. The first challenge again, is how do we flatten out this cube? And you might be thinking, wow, there might be a mathematical expression. You might, scale everything down by the z-axis to 0, but all that isn't very nice of a solution because then you get overlapping. But if you remember, every object, at least every primitive, comes with its very own UV unwrap. What is a UV unwrap? A UV unwrap is already a set of instructions on the XY plane of how to flatten this, because UV is 2-dimensional, whereas our cube is 3-dimensional. So let's just kind of like dumb this down a little, remove all the neurons until we're down to this 2-dimensional drooling mess. Again, this is a set of instructions that can do that, okay? So what we are going to do, again, the idea here is we're going to start off with our initial coordinates. As always, position coordinates tell us the x, y, z vectors for everything on the surface. And we this time want to import in our UV coordinates. This is the 2-dimensional instructions. So if we just add in some vector math, and you'll see how this works in a second, we add some vector math, we start with our UV coordinates, so this is what we want to send it to, and then we subtract away the position coordinates. And by the way, just remember, we start with UV coordinates and we always subtract away the initial position just so that we have the deformation to displacement, but not the original coordinates to begin with, because otherwise what we'd have is something that looks like this, right? Like it's the transformation we don't want because it's still trying to hold on to, it's trying to retain that ex, that girlfriend that you can't let go of. I know that. It's trying to retain that position vector. So if we subtract this away, boom. Now you're seeing something that's a bit closer, at least it's on the XY plane. And you might be thinking, okay, now we have this 2-dimensional unwrap thing. Why is it not looking exactly like the cross? And the answer is, if you think about it, if we were to do this deformation, it would have to cut into the cube, so it has to do a cut here, here, and here, so that it could unfold it like origami and do it 2-dimensionally. Now, this is not something that can be done because these edges are connected. How is it supposed to rip? So all we have to do is go to the edges, right-click, and I know technically this is modeling on the cube, but we're not going to count it, okay? Just kind of forget about it. You could do an edge split modifier if that makes you feel better. Just run an edge split, okay? And this is, again, going to tear these edges apart so that it can unfold it like origami. I'm not going to count this as cheating in November, okay? If you count this as cheating in November, that's your fucking problem, okay? It's not that big of a deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to keep organized this time like I was talking about. This is the node that we're going to be sending our displacement instructions to. So what I found is useful, and menu, add a bit of color, okay? So we know this is what we are sending it to, and maybe also give this a bit of color, okay? Awesome, let's save our amazing progress. As always, I like to give this a name, something that can be memorable and is important. And of course that is I have a Patreon, okay? It exists, you could get the blend file, etc. But you are learning how to make it here, okay? So now we've kind of gone through the very first challenge, which is taking our cube and unwrapping it into something 2-dimensional. And in fact, again, I mentioned that we actually don't need a vector displacement node. Thank you, Arendelle, for that tip. But we can do the scaling transformation manually as well, where we are scaling our displacement instructions just to see how this unwrap comes to be when we set this to 1. So next thing we want to do is center this, so why not just add in a bit of vector math, which we can duplicate. Actually, I don't want to duplicate, everything's going wrong. I don't want to duplicate it since I don't want that red from the node. So let's add in vector math, put that in here, and if we want to bring it downwards by 0.5, because again, it's being sent. If you think of the unwrap as a set of instructions where this is the origin, this is set to 0, well, what we want is this to be the origin. So we just want to displace by -0.5, -0.5, and you don't need the z-axis, okay? So let's just do that. Now we have this centered. Next step is making this a bit bigger because it's looking like the unwrap is very, very small. Kind of like when an old person, they start shrinking like a raisin and you start thinking, damn, I want to eat that. That's starting to look tasty. But you can't, you know you can't. We can scale this up just like a multiplication on the x, y, and z axis. I'm just going to scale this up by 3. And now our transformation looks exactly like a cube. Again, a cube, flattening out and then adjusting with the addition and scaling up by 3. Okay? So here's where the very complicated part, at least if you're not very used to vector displacement, here's where the complicated part starts to come to be, okay? So remember the trick from before in November day 2 and 3. I know it's hard to remember. Remember how, that being said, remember how we turned our cube into a sphere, right? We said a sphere probably has a complicated mathematical formula, so let's use a trick, a very simple trick to describe what a sphere is. A sphere is just a set of points where all the vectors on the sphere are equidistant from the origin. They have the same scale, magnitude, ganas, desire. And a circle is basically the same thing, but two-dimensional. And it's a good thing that our displacement so far is on the xy plane, because effectively we can treat this as a sphere, but only look at the cross-section, the circle, the great circle on the xy plane. And I know I'm saying a lot of words. It's confusing. Let's do, not say, okay? So what I'm saying is we can take our displacement instructions so far, again, everything before we get to the red nodes, which we're just going to keep connecting to, right? What we can do is just do the same trick from before. So my mouse is lagging out. My mouse is not liking that. There we go. Never get a wireless mouse, guys. Pro tip. That's a MOG Pro Gamer tip. What we're going to do is we are going to connect this and evaluate the length, the magnitude of these vectors. And we want to say, okay, all of these aren't going to be the exact vectors. You know what? Let's just wait a second for this thing to come back. There we go. These aren't going to be the exact vectors of a circle or of a sphere, so what we need to do is correct so that they are, okay? So what we are going to be doing is scaling our vectors. So we are going to be scaling them by what? Not by our length, but by a adjusted length. So we can add in a math node. And the trick here was to take the reciprocal, so division 1 over, just like that, not 2 over, 1 over. And what this is doing, again, is we have our displacement instructions. We're looking at the length, and we're saying these aren't unit length. They're not all the same scale, which is what would make it a circle. So we just take the reciprocal so that they are all brought back down to earth and normalized is another way to think about that. And then we scale it by that quantity. And if we connect this right here, you see that gives us a pretty messed up circle, but a circle nonetheless. The reason this isn't working too well is because we're running pretty low on geometry. So let's actually view how much geometry we have. We can do that with the wireframe node, remember? Wireframe, connect that right there. You see we're running pretty low on geometry. So let's add in a subsurf, or subdivision surface, really. Control 3 for 3 levels of subdivision, set it to simple, okay? And you see the more divisions we have, the more, the more detail we're gonna get in our circle, which is pretty cool. Okay, so what do we have so far? We have a cube being turned into a circle. Now, some of you who are very observant are probably shitting their pants right now. They're probably running home to the hills because there's not that much geometry in the center of the circle. And you're thinking, big deal, who cares? Well, the thing is, if we want to add in more vector displacement steps, the issue with that is we need, again, more geometry. And the thing is, no matter how much geometry we add into this, unlike before where now we have cleaner and cleaner displacement, now it doesn't really matter. All this geometry we're adding is converging to the ring because that's where everything is being scaled to. It's being scaled to the outskirts, meaning that we don't have any geometry in the center. And that means we can't do any more displacement. So now the question is, how do we kind of fix this idea where we still get the circle, but leave some geometry behind? So this is where it gets kind of confusing. So try to follow along, okay? Just do your best. So going back, we did our UV unwrap and we were calculating for the length, and then we did the adjustment, whatever. What we want to do is somehow preserve some part of the center here and just take the outskirts, kind of the rim, and do that scaling operation, okay? So how do we do that? First of all, I'm going to add a greater than operation right here, just so we can kind of make a interior circle right here. And this circle is basically going to define, god damn it, dude, that air freshener is giving me a jump scare every day. It's going to give me a heart attack one day. Every 18 minutes, I forgot what I set it to. This circle is going to be our geometry preservation circle. And everything around it, and again, we don't want this to be too big, because if it's too big, we're not going to have circle in this corner, because we need some white around every part of this boundary. We want the white to converge to the circle. So what we want to do is kind of center this. So let's add in a addition before it reaches the length, so before that's even evaluated. So let's just put this here. And what we can do is just shift the circle so it's kind of in the center of this cross. And I'm sure that has heavy religious symbolism, but what we want to do is just make the largest circle that we can that still has outskirts. So again, notice that there's a bit of white just over here, maybe not enough. Let's set this down to 0.5, just so that there's a bit of white going around every part of the circle. And then And then we want to basically adjust our scaling factor so it's not taking the reciprocal everywhere, but just doing that in the white areas, okay? To do that, what we are going to do, and I get it, it's confusing, it's quite a jump. This is like when you go up to that next math class and you didn't read the textbook, I get it. What we're gonna do is just do some mixing stuff and it will all make sense in a second. So, right now we are using this as our mixing factor, meaning the black is the first socket and the white is the second socket. For the first socket, we want to scale by 1, so bring it up to 1 because that's saying scale by 1, do nothing. That is the identity multiplication, right? When you multiply by 1, nothing happens. Otherwise, where you have white, do the reciprocal trick, okay? So basically what we have is a map that's the reciprocal map, but just keeping the circle stationary, keeping it true to itself. And this is what we're going to scale by. So let's see what happens when we do it like this. And what you are seeing is that this is looking heavily damaged. This this vector displacement might have some daddy issues. It might have a bit of a trip ahead of it. So the question is, why is this not working perfectly? And the answer is, it's obvious. Again, every time we do vector displacement, we need to use the step from before. So again, it's not this displacement that we want to put in here. This is not what we want to do our adjusted scale for. Remember, we did this tiny addition, so don't forget about tiny details like that, and boom, now we have a circle. And the impressive thing about this is if we view it this time, it's going to have a bit more geometry. Let's see it a bit better. Now you see that the center circle has some geometry preserved. So again, the idea was before we had the exact same transformation, the same reciprocal trick. Whoops, I guess I went a bit too far. Imagine that we had the thing from before, because I guess that's gone. We had the same thing, but the geometry wasn't here. But now we've at least managed to preserve a tiny bit of geometry, and this is kind of the reason why, like, later on we're going to need a lot of subdivisions, because we can only kind of salvage, this is all we can afford to keep. Okay, so now we have some geometry in the center, and what we can do is try to have this geometry work a lot for us. So what we want to do is kind of extrapolate, kind of extend this geometry just so it's, you know, going right to the outskirts. So that's just going to be, you could do it as another transformation, or you could do this as a adjustment here. Probably makes more sense to do this as an adjustment here. Yeah, let's go for it. So if you were to make this not scaled by 1, in other words, keeping that center circle from before constant, but you were to bring that up, that should work. Yes, now you can see that we can go past the limits of what you thought was possible. In other words, what's happening here again is the white part of the cross from before is going to the outskirts, and the interior part is being scaled by a constant like 1.28, 1.3, something like that, meaning that the circle is kind of taking up more of the interior. So the next step, now that we've kind of solved this geometry issue, we solved it so well, by the way, that we may as well take all of this, Control-G to group it up. Now that we have solved this issue, now we want to kind of just go forwards, not worrying about geometry or anything like that, and we can make the terrain, we can make the hay, we can make, what the hay? We can make the rest, okay? So to make this kind of thing look mountainous, it's actually much easier than everything we did before. Again, we are going to be adding more vector displacement steps in between. The name of the game is adding as much here before we get to this red node of the subtraction, the scale, the geometry. You can think of this as the vector displacement node. To do that mountainous thing, what we're going to do is just bring in some noise. And again, you want to be careful whenever you're bringing in these noise or wave textures or whatever it may be, because each one you add in is going to slow everything down. And we are going to be adding quite a few. So let's add in some vector math again to incorporate this idea. Addition means incorporate. We are going to take this, our previous step, and add in this case, we only want the z-axis, so it's going up and down, but not along the xy vector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to only take the factor, only the one-dimensional quantity, plug it into the z, and let's see what we get. Ba-boom! Now we are getting mountainy terrain that again is corresponding, obviously, corresponding to our noise. So we can make the noise very small, and we could change the quality of it, etc. But something to consider is you notice that when we plug this in, not only did it do that, but it kind of drifted everything upwards, right? The reason this happens is because on average, and we talked about this a billion times, when you add a noise, it's going to add in to every point a number between 0 and 1, or in this case, a vector x 0, 0, right? And then some number between 0 and 1, which means on average, we are adding a z value of 0.5. So to correct for this, and again, this is why it's drifting upwards by exactly 0.5. To correct for this, we just add in a bit of math, we subtract by 0.5, and everything is good, no matter what we do here, okay? So I'm just going to add in some low frequency noise, and it might help to have a bit more geometry here. Some low frequency noise just so it has a bit of variation, a bit of mountainy terrain. And now you're thinking, okay, I thought we kind of fixed this issue about the corners, or I guess the perimeter. And remember, even though we have a lot of geometry in the center, most of the geometry is on the outskirts, so kind of a lot of weird stuff happens here because we have maybe 90% of the points on the outskirts. To get rid of this, we could either do, some correction here before it even reaches, or you could just do a bit of patchwork and say, forget about it, nobody has to know, okay? To do that, what we're gonna do is add in another vector math, set this one to length right here, and connect this. And what we can do is create a circular mask saying, do this noise in the center, but not on the perimeter, which will exactly solve our problem, okay? So let's add in a map range node right there. Look at that map range node. That's looking like it's just in the right spot. And what we want to do is have the number 1 on the interior saying multiply our noise by 1, in other words, keep it, and black on the exterior. So first of all, let's invert our mask. And second of all, let's bring it up so that the interior is very white, just like that. And by the way, I know that this is looking pretty messed up. This is kind of a artifact of not having enough division. So the more you add, the more circular it's gonna look. But also this is a visual artifact. It's not actually an issue. It's gonna work out fine. The way you wanna imagine this is as a nice radial gradient where the center is 1 and the exterior is black at 0. And what we can do, same thing from before, in the same way that we adjusted by subtracting 0.5, we can just do a bit more math before it even reaches. So let's multiply it by this map range, which will give us, if we visualize it, it will give us the same deformation, but you see it's kind of pinning the exterior, kind of like a tarp. You remember kindergarten, you were all in gym class, you had that massive, that thing that you would raise and everybody would go under, and you had that colorful thing. Now people just use it as a creative way to get baked. But you can see what we are doing is pinning the corners, and that's probably more obvious if we get rid of this geometry, which we no longer need to see. So no matter what it is that we do to this noise, even if we make it crazy, the perimeter is going to be pinned. Okay, beautiful. Let's set this to shade smooth. So now that we have control over this, and maybe we could even add in a multiplication slider to control the strength of this deformation. That can be a parameter we access later. Now that we have that, the name of the game, and this is kind of the interesting part, this is like, how did you get fur out of a cube? Now that we have our terrain, we can make our wheat, our grain, the point of this November challenge, okay? So let's stay organized over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group, let's connect this right here. I'm going to group this as our second step, Control G, put that in there. So now everything's looking nice. So again, what we have is kind of our vector displacements in a bunch of steps that we kind of bundled together. So first we have our turning it into a circle, which looks like this cube turning into a circle. Boom. And then we have our geometry adjustment if we didn't do that already, and also our noise added. So let's just add in a parameter for this. So we want to be able to control the strength, which is this one, of the noise from the exterior, okay? So now at any point, my mouse is dying. At any point, we can control that. Okay, next step, the one that I was very hyped about, adding in the grain, the big, the what the hay, okay? To do that, what we are gonna do is we are first gonna make a mask really, on the floor saying this is our growth mask. This is where the hay is actually gonna be growing from, okay? And what that's gonna end up looking like really is just a bunch of circles all over the floor. So Voronoi texture, make sure that you connect your last step from the vector displacement. If we don't, you're gonna see that there's gonna be some heavy distortion along the edges, which of course this is gonna have as well, but it's gonna be looking a bit better. And don't worry about the perimeter because we're not gonna be growing it on the perimeter. If you remember the original render, I very intentionally, and you might have noticed this, you might have not, probably didn't, I very intentionally made it a circle cutoff just so we wouldn't be messing with the perimeter where I knew there would be some geometry issues, okay? So don't worry about stuff like that. Just let your little head go to sleep. So we have our mask that we can control basically how many dots. And again, the reason I added in Voronoi is it's a very good way to add in a bunch of circles very quickly and effectively very randomly as well. I'm going to do greater than and basically create a bunch of circles. Let's do an inversion, so not greater than, but less than. There we go. And don't let anyone tell you that you're less than, okay? This is going to be the number of grains, the number of growth points. So the bigger this is, the more geometry we're going to need. And this is already a nice way, again, to get a bunch of dots in a very chaotic way that I assume that wheat probably grows in. I don't know, I'm not a farmer. So that's the first thing. We now want to take this and cut off the exterior. So again, that's the same trick that I've shown you. I've been hitting you over the head. It's probably looking pretty deformed now. Millions of times. We set this to length, and then what we do is let's use another less than, greater than situation so we can make a cutoff, and we can visualize this. Let's view it from the top. We are just going to make this part of the interior. And again, this artifacting is geometry based. Do not worry about it. So take these two ideas, multiply them together. In other words, saying and. So now we have dots only on the interior. And if you are worried, you can make that circle a bit smaller. And now the thing that makes this look really good, and this is not originally what I had, but I had a, this is where the farmer friend came into play. What she said is that you want rows. You want rows of wheat, not just a circular growth of wheat. Because if we have it like this, I guess I can show you what it's going to look like. What we're going to do is take our previous vector displacement. We are going to add in, so another vector math node. We are going to add in this, but only on the z-axis like we've done a couple of times. So let's, not a vector math, let's add in a combine x, y, z. Take this, put it here, and put it on the z-axis. What this is going to do when we connect it is it's going to take our transformation from before and just add a bunch of these. And this is where we could switch the subdivision mode. So pro tip, guys, this is what I was referring to earlier. If you set the feature set to experimental, it does a bunch of stuff, but one of the experimental features is it's going to let you use adaptive subdivision, which is like normal subdivision. However, Blender does it in a very intelligent way. It's going to divide only however much it needs to, depending on your view. So if you're very far away, doesn't need to divide that much once we calculate it. When it's very close, it's going to be doing a lot of division, and we can set the dicing scale, okay? In other words, how much geometry is it that we want? Let's take a bit of a water break. And while I do that, let's let it render. We'll let it chug on something like 0.2, so a smaller number means more divisions. Always love me some water. So what you're seeing here is that now we have kind of individual kind of, you could think of it as a first system because we have so much resolution in our mesh. Trying to get my bearings back. And what we want to do, just to make this a bit more visible, we want it to be more readable, I guess is a way to say that. When we multiply this, it's going to be the strength before it even reaches the z component. In other words, how tall, how much is the addition happening. So how tall is this going to be? So let's set it to something like 0.3. And when we view it like this, you see it's looking pretty cool. However, it's not very readable. It just kind of looks like, maybe it looks like a bit of a carpet, which might be something in the November future. I don't know. But it's looking like a carpet. What gives this a lot of readability and what makes this look like wheat is the rows. Okay, so let's just connect our previous vector displacement step from before. I feel like I've lost it. There we go. Want to keep that position node up top. So now we only have our terrain, our displaced circle, and we can actually read, or we can actually view our map without any distraction. What we want to do is add in rows, and you can do that mathematically and save on a bit of computation, or you could be lazy like us and use a wave texture. Again, any node that you use here is going to be using generated coordinates, which do come along for the ride. However, at this point, they're very heavily distorted. So we're just going to use our previous vector displacement step, okay? So this, anytime we add in one of these orange nodes, again, it's going to be closer and closer to not being able to render. So I do recommend doing this mathematically yourself, but do as I say, not as I do. We're just going to do this wave texture to save on time. So this is going to give us rows. We can do the greater than, less than trick to make these thicker rows. So let's set this to 0.5, just so that we have equidistance, equi-man spreading between these black and white rows. I wonder if you saw this on the train, would you be freaked out? Probably, just this black and white hovering thing. We want to bring the scale down so that there are fewer rows, and just like last time, we are just going to multiply this idea together before it even reaches the combine XYZ. So let's multiply by this, which now gives us this map, which has three things going on, really. First of all, we have the dot map, which goes everywhere once it loads. This is the dot map. Second of all, we have the one we just made, the stripe map. And finally, we have the radial map. So these are basically a bunch of constraints that all come together to make a field that we can control procedurally. So let's view that like this. And again, at this point, we're going to kind of be suffering, really suffering through some pretty long render time. So every time we do an adjustment, do expect some time for it to catch up. In fact, we can make it a little lower resolution. So yeah, it looks worse. However, stuff's going to update faster. So the nice thing about this, again, is we can control everything procedurally. We can always change the number of rows on the fly. We can offset the rows with the phase offset, just so they're kind of pushed along. And then we get new rows coming out of here once we push far enough, etc. And one thing that I did that apparently isn't correct is I wanted to add a bit of distortion to these rows. So you see there's this nice wavy thing. However, again, in modern days, the tractors, whatever it is farmers use, I don't know. Maybe they should do a tutorial on this. They cut in very straight lines, okay? So there really isn't a point in adding any distortion. At this point, we can do a bit of creative control. I'm going to go back and add a bit more terrain. That, again, everything's going to adjust to because it grows like this. And maybe that was a mistake. Maybe that was a bit too much terrain. It grows fine. Let's add in a bit more interest here. So I want to add some visual variation. So not just the height of this, but maybe we also want to control which grains or which strands are higher than others. To do this, what we can do is in the same way that we have a strength slider, what we can do is add a offset slider. So we are going to add by... Remember, what Voronoi texture gives you is not only this distance function that we can make the circles from, but a random number, a random color, in fact. So let's actually visualize that. A vector, which is x, y, z, for every one of those fragments. So that's our random number generator. Meaning, what we can do is we can take this and only take the first component, x, y, or z, and add it in here. And now you see, we have quite a bit of variation. And in fact, I guess we want to do this addition before we reach this part here, because then it's going to be adding it to different parts of the circle. So you want to do it right after you get here. So what we're going to do is addition, boom. And so again, the masks are actually going to work is the point here. And add this in. So now we have variation, as you can see. And we want to add variation control. In other words, a strength slider, another multiplication, but for the variation. So when this is set to 0, we have no variation. When this is set to like 0.3, we have very little variation, but it does look a bit nicer. So let's make this look higher resolution. So really, this is the core idea behind this, but there's one more kind of important trick I want to go over other than the vector displacement, and then I'm probably going to kind of leave you off to make your dirt and puddles and all that, because that's the part that's a bit much. Vector displacement's the important part of these tutorials. The question is, how do we make one material for the ground and one material for the weed? It's not, it's not very obvious how you might do that, even though it might feel that way. So what we want to do is have two BSDFs, mix them together, and let's make a bit of a distinction. One of them is going to be white and one of them is going to be yellow for the wheat. And again, the question is, how do we make our mixing factor to separate one BSDF from another? Well, first of all, let's clean up a bit like I said we would. So we'll connect this right here. And let's turn this into a node group. So this is going to be our hey, our what the hey node group. Let's move this all over and do a save since we haven't saved in a while. And by the way, you're like, why are your mouse movements so bad? It's because my mouse is failing on me mid-tutorial, and I'm trying to keep cool, but really it's pissing me off, okay? What we want to do before we do any other stuff is add a couple parameter sliders that we can control. So first of all, let's control the strength of the hay. So that's this one. We also want to control the strength of the variation, which was right here, I believe. Yeah, so it was the multiplication before the addition. And then, honestly, you want every aspect of this wave texture, the rows, the scale, all that. But I'm just going to keep the scale, which is the number of rows, because the rest of this will, whatever. You can add in all the parameters you want. And I guess there's one more thing. Again, to get the separation, which is what we're talking about between the hay and the floor, what we need is the exact mask. I guess before we multiplied by the strength, we want this also on the output. So again, this, if we visualize it, is going to be the dot mask, which moves with the deformation. And this is kind of the key idea here about how to do the separation. Again, this is the dot mask, but it's moving with the geometry. So before we did this deformation, it's going to look exactly like this. Well, you'll see it in a second. This is the dot map, but it's going to be moving with the deformation. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, I don't know what the big deal is, so we've set this as an output, and then we use this as the mixing factor. Okay, so use this as the mixing factor. The issue is when you do this, if you can get yourself to do this, there you go. The issue is when you do this, and I guess we need to invert these two, you're going to see that it kind of does what we want, and it's actually looking pretty good in this case, but you're seeing that there's some white bleed off from the ground into here, okay? So while you think this is a perfect mixing factor, it does have a bit of an issue. And this is another one of those issues that gets resolved as we go lower and lower and lower in our subdivision number, so I'll just do one. It's going to take a second to process. But the more geometry we have, the closer that cutoff is going to be to being accurate. However, we do need to add in quite a bit of geometry, especially at the base here, to get this right. So we do need some kind of Hail Mary, some kind of solution to solve this, okay? And we're going to do this with another Arendelle trick. Thank you, Arendelle, for this one. What we're going to be doing is just going to copy. We're going to be copying a lot of these nodes over to create a second mask, not for the deformation, not for saying where do we add on the z-axis, again, to make the hay, but just slightly bigger circles. So that we have a bit of buffer room, and this is going to be the mask for the mix shader, okay? So what do we want to do? I'm just going to copy. So again, we don't need to reuse our noise because that would be very expensive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these over. I'm sure we don't need all of them, but we'll figure it out in a second. So really what we want to do is have the exact same setup that we had as before over here, except this time we are going to have the Voronoi, where it connects, have a kind of bigger threshold. So again, let's just repeat these steps from before. So this should be connected here, and then we use the same slider. And I know it's getting a bit messy, and we didn't really need to copy all of these nodes, but whatever, it's fine. This one has a copy from here. So again, I'm just mirroring whatever I see. This third node up top is connected to the length, so we connect it like this. This node is connected to wave texture. I guess I'm not really thinking too much about what any of it means. You just connect and pray, really. And let's see what this gives us. So first of all, I'm just going to turn off the deformation so it's not as confusing. So again, we're going one step backwards in time. Hopefully you're getting a good sense for this at this point. So let's go into this node. So we can visualize our mask. Wow, this is going really slowly. And we don't need the strength operator, by the way. So we can visualize our mask from before. Again, this is going to be the dot map, and what I'm hoping is that this one gives an identical result. And it seems like it is. Let's just visualize it one more time. Yes, it seems like it's giving almost the same thing with one difference. What are we missing here? Are we missing something? It's not too important if we are, because again, this gray stuff is on the interior. So it's actually not a big deal because we do want that to be colored anyways. Let's see, what do we have going on here? We'll not worry about it too much. What we want for this mask is we want the same setup, but this time the Voronoi is going to be not as strict. So I think we bring this up. Yeah, now you see the circles are getting a bit bigger. So that's one thing we can do. Again, we want to expand the mask a little. And the other thing we can do is be a little less harsh on the wave texture. So we can make that cutoff a little bit bigger too. So you can see I just expanded the rows a little. So from 0.5 to 0.55, from I don't remember what it was, from like 0.42, 420 to 0.6. So this is going to be a little less harsh, and we can have this be another output. And this can be this would probably be a good time to name that one. So the bottom output is going to be our expanded mask, okay? Boom. So now let's view the newest vector displacement step. So now we're going to have the same thing as before when it loads. So let's just view that. And this time, and again, this isn't going to solve it perfectly. Again, you're always going to need to add in more geometry, or at least make the circles kind of fading in so it's not as harsh. But this time what we can do is, instead of using the original mask, we can use our expanded one, and it should look just a tiny bit better. Okay, and now you can see it's looking much fuller. Again, it's going to look way better once you do your render with your geometry and all this. But you can see the difference from before and after. That's looking much fuller, much thicker. And again, you go down to 0.1 and it's going to be practically solved once it does that. Yeah, it's looking a lot better. Okay, so really this is kind of the end of the tutorial, how to make it. Really all you're going to be doing at this point is maybe modifying this shader. I think what I did for this one to make it look more realistic is I used a translucent with the same color instead of a BSDF. So I just plug that in there. Whoops. Which one is this? Is plugged into the bottom one. plug that in there. This is usually the kind of thing you use whenever you have grass or something like that, and you just want to make it like a lot brighter, like 1.3 or something. You just want to play around with that, the saturation. Translucent is usually the way to go with these things. And then for the ground, pretty much all I did is I added in a noise texture. And you could either use the vector displacement stuff from before, or maybe just add in object coordinates. Point is, just don't use generated coordinates because we so heavily distorted them. I basically used some noise for the base color to add a bit of variation. And I guess we want the factor, not the color. Just to add in a bit of variation, and then I added in a color ramp. And at this point, yeah, I mean, this is kind of the easy stuff, so that's why I'm not going over it perfectly. You make it more ground colored, less saturated. And kind of the final thing you want to do is also use this as a bump map. So put this in here, connect this to the height, connect this to the normal, and now wherever you have noise, you have that going on as well. So it's a good thing to add in some detail, to add in a bit of roughness. Make this not as rough, or make it more rough rather in the material sense, just so we can have a bit more readability and it's not shiny. And then, you kind of just mess around with this to make it look like a ground. And you can see that I actually did that quite a bit. In fact, I just added BSDFs on top of each other. I added in a couple rocks, some puddles. That's just Musgrave with a principled BSDF mixed in with a roughness set to 0, so it's perfectly reflective. But really, this is kind of the end of the tutorial, right? We can control every aspect of this, and when we render, it's going to look a lot fuller, a lot thicker. Let's make this a lot less saturated. It's kind of blinding. This is the kind of radioactive hay. It's made next to an atomic plant. But yeah, there you go. You can always go back and control stuff like the scale. Again, this is the number of rows, whatever. And yeah, the cool thing about this, again, you already know this. It was a cube, and now just from a cube, we got this. So anyways, hopefully you, well, what a wrap up. I'm sure you can take this to completion. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, and you want to see some exclusive stuff, some Discord access, some behind the scenes, some blend projects, again, the finished blend project, not this one, but the one I made from before with the puddles where it's looking a bit more sophisticated, all that is going to be available over on the Patreon. I want to thank all 500 some people, a lot of new people recently who I'm sure are coming because of November and want to see all those blend files, etc., and play with those. Welcome aboard. Thank you for joining, and for all the new people who are considering as well. It really is the best way to keep Default Cube and CG Matter afloat. Doing November tutorials for 30 days, it's not a very sustainable idea, but I wanted to do it because I think there's a lot to be learned, especially on the vector displacement front. So anyways, that stuff exists over on the Patreon. Again, the blend file is going to be over there. And that, my friends, is the end of the show. This decomposing corpse is going to go back to bed. And yeah, see ya.